Welcome in, everybody. Welcome back to
Hello.
another episode of Underqualified with a very special guest. Our Aunt Carolyn is joining us today to talk about some really cool things. This is going to be the first time that we've had a guest that we weren't all just talking about our experiences, because if you guys have been watching, we had Mom on to talk about our journeys through music, but that wasn't really like a topic that we did research on. That was just a personal discussion. So I'm really excited to actually have a topic to be working on today. We're going to be doing all sorts of stuff about language, which I think is really interesting and frankly doesn't get enough credit for how interesting it is. As always, for those of you who might be new to the podcast, we have 3 rules around here. The first rule is that everyone involved in Underqualified will do everything in our power to only say things that are true as far as we know. But because the name of the podcast is Underqualified, we don't guarantee that. Second, if you are someone who knows more about whatever it is that we're talking about than we do, we require you, by law, I say, to comment either with corrections or just sharing your thoughts on what we've been talking about. And third, and most importantly, is just be nice, because we do this because we like it. We like talking to each other about things that we think that are cool. So don't be too hard on us if we get things wrong. But I want to let Benjamin go ahead and kick things off for us and talking a little bit about sort of the baseline, what makes a language a language.
Yeah, so this is just sort of gonna establish the basis for the rest of the topic. So what actually is language? And I guess the easiest place to start was just I Googled definition of language.
Sure.
And here's what came up is the principal method of human communication consisting of words used in a structured and conventional way and conveyed by speech, writing, or gesture is the first one. And then second, a system of communication used by a particular country or community. And so that's sort of just like the dictionary entry. And then there's not a whole lot of articles to reference about actually defining specifically what language is and like narrowing the scope of what
Sure. It's hard to pin
language
down.
can be. But there is this one article that is sort of in that vein. It's called Observations on What is Language from thoughtco.com. And so it's by Richard Nordquist. I'm not super confident in the credibility of the source, but it seems well written, so we're going to go with it. And so there's sort of the dictionary definition, and then there's the more emotional response. He quotes this guy named Guy Dutcher, who is an associate professor of English. Oh no, that's a different guy. Okay, Guy Dutcher said in his seminal work, The Unfolding of Language, an evolutionary tour of mankind's greatest invention, that language is what makes us human.
Oh.
And so that's sort of a more, the touchy-feely sort of example of what language can be. But what's sort of interesting to me in defining the scope of what we're talking about with language is just that it's a system of communication. So anything that conveys another idea to somebody else based off of my Google definition can be considered language. And so that brings up, in my mind, the question of, well, is language just what I'm speaking with words to you now that have a denotative meaning, and you can understand them and process that information and come up with a response in the same sort of verbal language. But then there's also, like, I'm speaking with my hands and I have facial expression. And so is that a part of language as well? Because that's still communicating information to you, even though it's not verbal.
Right.
And then it brings up another point of systems of expression and communication that are connotative and not denotative. So, for example, dance and music and ritual, et cetera, that all has an understood meaning from one person to another, but it's not expressed in the same way as like my speaking or if I were to write it down. And so this actually gets, as a musician myself, one of the most interesting sort of points to talk about is whether or not music in and of itself is language. Like, are music and language synonymous? A lot of times with like choral singing or just solo singing in general, we have text. And so that is sort of a combination of music and language, but if you remove the text from the singing and you were to sing everything like on a neutral syllable, or if we're talking about instrumental works, it can still convey an emotional understood message or a general impression of the piece. And so there's still a communication of ideas happening there. And so does that mean that music in and of itself is a language because you're using that as a tool to communicate ideas to somebody else? And so, and we'll hear a lot of the times sort of this cliche message that music is the universal language.
Yeah, it's a popular one.
Right, which comes up a lot and is sort of problematic in many ways because yes, music has been observed in every culture, but it's many unique and varying forms of music. And so there's this particular study that I wanted to talk about, that I will pull up in my myriad of tabs. There's this article that we should be immediately skeptical of because the title is "Music is a Universal Language, New Harvard University Study Proves." And it's like, studies don't prove things.
Anything.
But so the general idea of this study is that so music is often assumed to be a human universal, emerging from an evolutionary adaptation specific to music and or a byproduct of adaptations for affect, language, motor control, and auditory perception. But universality has never actually been systematically demonstrated, and it's challenged by the vast diversity of music across cultures. So that's the idea that they're sort of trying to address through their ethnographic data and analysis from 315 different cultures.
Oh, wow.
And so it's a large body of data that they're looking at to sort of demonstrate the universality and function of music in different cultures. And basically what they came to is that there are 13 different emotional responses that can be experienced through music. So it can be found to be amusing, annoying, anxiety producing, beautiful, calm, dreamy, energizing, erotic, indignant, joyful, sad, scary, or triumphant. And
those are many things.
Yeah, those are a lot of different things that can be experienced. And there seems to be a low level of like cultural knowledge beforehand that is necessary to experience that same meaning from a piece of music ahead of time. But so does that prove that music is a universal language? I raise a number of questions on that line of thinking that I will now pepper you with questions and just see what you think. So, music is a language. Can it give instructions? Can it say yes or no? Can music lie to me? Can I translate music into another language? And so, like any of those questions that get down to more specific or narrows the scope of the purpose of language as a system of communication. Well, if we can't use music to do these things, if we can't use music to have a to have a denotative meaning beyond just the emotions that we're experiencing along with music, then I sort of push back against the idea that it's a language. And additionally, it's definitely not a universal language because it can take so many different forms, and like our system of Western tonality and hearing things within a key is not experienced in every culture. There are cultures of music that hear pitch differently than we do, and so can hear notes in between just a half step on a keyboard. So you go to like C to C sharp on a keyboard, that's the smallest interval that can happen in Western music, and there are cultures that sing like quarter tones in between that, and so that's music happening in a different way. And so definitely it doesn't take the same form in every culture. It's experienced differently in every culture. And even though we might experience some of the same emotions, we would articulate those things in very different ways. And so basically what I'm getting at is that denotative for denotative forms of communication, there's a clear element of meaning. The meaning is independent from the context. It's unambiguous. And anything that is connotatively communicative, there are multiple concepts in meaning. It totally depends on context. It's subjective. So you can look at the same sort of presentation of information and interpret it differently. So we can look at denotative communication as, language or mathematical formulas.
Sure.
I'm actually taking a lot of this discussion about music from my music history class. So just want to give a quick shout out to Dr. Schultze at the University of North Texas. But when we're talking about connotative communication, dance, poetry, painting, and the gestures or rituals or music that I was referring to before, those are all systems of connotative communication. But since that's sort of how music should be defined. It's a connotative system of communication as opposed to a language that can be denotatively understood.
That's what I was going to say, and it sounds like that you agree with me, that I would assert that music in particular, we're largely saying choral expression as opposed to individual, or group singing or things of that nature, has a universal connotative ability. So the easiest example for me is I have sung wordless jazz pieces that are clearly extremely emotional, and there's not a single word of any language in there. It's just entirely expression. But at the same time, as you said, context is so important, because if you don't know the language and it is being sung in a particular language in a particular way, you can totally misconstrue the context of that musical experience. And so I'm thinking I took a cultural anthropology class in college, and we watched examples of Tibetan throat singing, which is fascinating to Western people, but in a way that irks me a little bit. It's fascinating in the sense that people look at it like it's strange, as opposed to looking at it like it's beautiful or something that's actually worth learning about, which is a different discussion that we could be having. And also of I believe it was a tribal dance from the Ute Indian tribe. I apologize if it was incorrect, but I believe that's what it was from. And we did a very similar sort of experiment, if you will, to what we're talking about right now in terms of context, where we watched these videos of these people. Well, it was just one man singing in the style of Tibetan throat singing, and then a group of people doing this traditional dance, which had drums and song and dance all at the same time. And we had to write down what we thought was going on. What's the song about? Or if there's a ritual, what's the ritual? And first of all, the interpretations of the people in the class were all across the board. And secondarily, the vast majority of them were incorrect, which I think is really detrimental to trying to claim that music is a language, because so many people got it wrong.
Right.
And
we can get into a discussion of the power of context for language as well. But I was thinking about that specifically with music, and one of the most sort of striking examples that I can come up with off the top of my head is how Gregorian chant, so the monophonic singing of the church from the Middle Ages, it was for hundreds of years presented in a church in a sacred context to present the unity of the church. And has also been used in countless cheapo horror movies to tell you that the monster's coming.
Right.
And so it's the same text, it's the same music, it's the same presentation of an idea, but used in an entirely in a diametrically opposed sort of context. So I don't know. It's an interesting discussion, but I think I'm maybe monopolizing a little bit more time than I planned to. So I'll cede the floor.
I'll take over a little bit with the segue of that. The Gregorian chant is a perfect example of how things get distorted, both unintentionally and intentionally, over time when it comes to language. And so I'm going to be paraphrasing pretty much exclusively from this article from this very reputable but an acronym that is very unfortunate. The Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences of the United States of America. And this is a research article called The Evolution of Language. It was published by Martin A. Nowak and David C. Krakauer. I apologize if I butchered either of those names. In looks like July of 1996. And so they approached study of the evolution of language from a mathematical context, which is really hard to pin down because, of course, we have no existing evidence of the evolution of language, because the thought is that written language likely came long after spoken language. And so the quote unquote study of what they call proto languages, which Benjamin, you actually kind of mentioned in passing at the beginning of what you were talking about, which is just using vocalizations and expressions to define specific things, is what's called a proto language. And there are many animals that exhibit this behavior. So you could think of like dolphins that have all sorts of clicks. Birds, for sure, have vastly varied mating and distress calls. So proto language is found all throughout the animal kingdom. And so what this study was hoping to ascertain and give some actual numbers to is, first of all, why we as humans have stepped beyond that and what some of the reasoning behind it might be. Because they talk about how language, true language, stems from the process of word formation. And so what they mean by word formation, and there's another quote later in here that I'm going to paraphrase because it's going to take me forever to find it, is it's the creation of infinite understanding from finite vocalizations. And so what that means is that we as as animals, our vocal cords only have the capability to produce a certain number of sounds. And so there would have been a point in the development of the very earliest proto-language that Homo sapiens were using that those individuals at that time, of course, they wouldn't have been aware of this, but they would have run into some sort of anatomical wall. So, the grunt that meant cave, or, the shout that meant danger, you have a certain number of those, and then eventually you sort of hit this wall. And so there's only two solutions to that. The first is to continue to try and come up with more and more complex vocalizations for whatever it is that you need to define, which gets very challenging and is not sustainable. Or you take those smaller sounds that you already have and you start to arrange them in a certain way that you can recontextualize them to mean different things. And so that is what they hypothesize is what led to the development of words. Because with these 26 letters that stem from the Arabic alphabet that have been adapted over the last several thousand years, we can create all sorts of different meanings while using the same vocalizations and sounds over and over again, versus having to have a specific vocalization for everything, which you can, just try and think of like, what is a car if not a car? Like, what is the shout that's going to mean car?
If cavemen had cars.
Exactly. If a caveman had a car, if a caveman saw a tree or a lake or a bird or a leopard.
That would be vroom.
Vroom. And so it gets really challenging because you have to come up with essentially what, to your suggestion, would probably be some sort of automatopoeic representation of whatever it is that you're talking about. And so they suggest that that is where the sort of the breaking point is, if you will. So humans are the only creature that have been able to step over that line. So every other animal that uses some form of proto-language as communication is stuck sort of in that earlier form where all of their sounds just mean a thing and there's no sort of extrapolation of phrases. And so another interesting point that they make is they do not think that language itself is an evolutionary trait. They think that language evolves sort of as its own thing, but it doesn't evolve in a truly naturally selective way. It's a byproduct of our evolution of developing a stronger form of like neural net processing. So it is a result of our larger brain capacity. It is not exactly something that would have been like a genetic mutation that then was selected for. So you could say that it has a certain amount of natural selection to it, in that the groups or tribes or individuals who were better at communicating with their fellow individuals would have done a better job of surviving, because that's how they think that language came to be, is it's a survival trait. You know, this is good, this is bad, there's a thing coming at us that we need to be concerned about, that tiger over there is asleep, so we're okay, that sort of thing. Tribes or cultures that were better at that were more likely to survive than those that existed essentially in silence, or just saying, you know, tree.
We're going to teach each other how to grow corn.
Right, exactly. And so that is actually where grammar comes from, which was really interesting to me because I suck at grammar. It has never been my strong suit. I've always been a really good writer who is really bad at grammar. And they talk about in this article, and which again, it's substantially longer than I'm making it sound and much more detailed. I highly recommend that if you can find it, you check it out. But that grammar was perhaps the most important part of the development of language. Because when they say grammar, and you're talking about the basal, like most basic forms of grammar, it just gives you context for what the noun that you're talking about is doing. And they talk about how much more important that is than simply naming the noun. And so they use the example of like, there is a leopard right there and it's awake, and we as a group need to deal with that, as opposed to there's a leopard over there that is asleep, which is something that we should be cautious about but don't necessarily have to deal with. And so the ability of those very early humans to convey that is, again, something that you could almost view in a naturally selective sense. So those groups that were more adept at that would have a much better job of surviving, and proliferating into the next generation, as opposed to those that either communicated to a lesser extent or simply didn't communicate at all. So there's a lot of, they break it down into actual mathematical equations, which I will admit was a little bit over my head. And then the most important part that they spend the most amount of time talking about is the linguistic error limit. And this ties back to what I was mentioning earlier, which is that there has to be some sort of way to fix miscommunications between groups. And so if you can't sort out these linguistic problems where, like, you know, one person's grunt means tiger, but to the other person, that grunt means something else. If there's no way to convey and sort that out, that particular form of communication crumbles because there's no continuum to it. So it's really fascinating, of course, trying to create mathematical situations for things that we have no evidence for, right? Because there's no way, you know.
It's hard to subtract language from our
You
can't have a control group of no language humans.
And so it really breaks down in sort of a categorical way of the way that this happened and how humans stepped over, if you will, the barrier that all other communicating animals seem to be stuck behind, which is really interesting. And personally, something that I was completely not aware of, you know, as far back as I had only ever heard about actual language, you know, so the English that we speak you've heard it described as like Germanic, the alphabet is Arabic in origin, you know, you hear about the Romance languages all the time, but all of those stem from a language that already existed. And so the conversation of how did we get to language at all was very fascinating to me. And so we're going to pivot a little bit from early language and what is language to let you talk about something a lot more specific.
Well, it's more like the use of language.
Yeah.
But I am Aunt Carolyn, and also I've been underqualified all my life, so I feel like I fit in well as a university teacher and learner at the University of Maryland. Shout out, go Terps. So I just want to comment on a couple of things that you all said, and then talk more about uses of language and how important it is in our culture. But when you're talking, Benjamin, about gestures, which is really hard not to do while you were on camera, that's we actually do consider that solid language. It has a name called pragmatics. And so when you're dealing with my specialty is special education disability studies, people who have difficulty learning language, it's often in the pragmatics. They stand too close, or they don't know what to say with their face. And so there's a lot of teaching that goes on with pragmatics. And another thing in terms of language development is that we often divide language into expressive and receptive. So that kind of makes you think a little bit about music also, because it's more of a receptive function. Rather than expressing, although you express yourself in
the performer
music.
is certainly expressing.
Yeah, so you could have some
receiving.
parallels with that. So thinking of languages as expressive and receptive is a way to think about it. And one more thing with music, I immediately went to, when you're talking about universal language of music, because of my background in disability, I immediately went to people who can't hear. Experience music really differently. And I would not consider it a language generally for people with hearing impairments. They don't generally think of music in the same way. Although I have seen visual, and you may have seen in your music background, totally visual interpretations of music. So sometimes can be interesting for people who have hearing impaired, but mainly they just don't really care about music.
Well, I mean, I can't imagine why.
I don't think you can say it's a distinctly universal human experience, because different people have different capabilities around music. But those are comments on my previous underqualified friends. Relatives, actually. But I was going to talk a little bit about one of the reasons we came across this topic is that talking about language and how it can unite and also divide. And this builds well on top of Nicholas's, the idea that language developed as a survival technique. So you think of it as totally positive feature of humankind. And it certainly has an amazing ability to unite people. And I just as a little sidebar, in terms of universality, I don't know if anybody out there has heard of Esperanto. You may have if you're interested in language, which is a totally I could say made up, but it's language designed to be easily learned. With very simple grammar, and again, the knowing the importance of grammar in making the ability of words to communicate so much more. But it was developed in the late 1800s, early 1900s to be able to have everybody learn it. So we don't have languages that are country-based, because that comes with all sorts of limits and politics. And so the idea was, that we would make this language that everybody could learn and everybody could speak, and then it would be a universal language.
Undo the Tower of Babel, if you will.
Yes, it would be awesome. And it would be something that I can't remember what the script was, but it was not pictographic, so automatically we would just cut out half of the world. Although interestingly, Japan was very interested in it, and they're one of the pictographic languages. So look at Esperanto as a way to think about language either uniting or dividing.
Well, I've heard that, and you might be able to talk about whether or not this is true better than I am, but I have heard from my friends who took ASL in college that ASL is not necessarily exactly a universal language, but it's closer than like just English.
So, I think that simplifies it, because it's so gestural. People think, oh, I can gesture and everybody will know what I'm saying. But then in fact, there's English sign language, there's Japanese sign language, there's as many different types of sign languages as there are languages. So
that's kind of what I figured. I was surprised when I heard that.
It's a little bit simplified. There's one cool thing about sign language is that tense is 3-dimensional. So this is present tense, this is future tense, and this is past tense.
Oh, I mean, it makes perfect sense.
So that's kind of cool.
That's very intuitive.
So that makes sense. And it was a developed language.
So, it was made.
So there's some second generation languages like Elvish. is a second
Yeah.
generation thing. I had to get that in there. The Elvish.
Shout out to J.R.R. Tolkien, who
Right.
created his own language
Right.
for a
And
book series.
so the Esperanto was really very difficult. I mean,
Yeah.
there's to try to make it descriptive and also simple and learnable. And of course, there's all sorts of critiques about it as its use. But the idea that language could be a uniter if we all understand it. And there's also ways that we use language to form groups.
Absolutely.
So professional language, acronyms, which are annoying to the out group, are super efficient and helpful in an in-group to learn how to communicate.
It's disastrous for health literacy.
It's
I get very
disastrous.
I get very up on
disastrous.
my soapbox about that.
But it's also so important to health professionals to communicate quickly around
Yes.
things that they need.
I have less of an issue with acronyms because acronyms are pretty quickly explained. I take serious issue with referring to a fever as like pyuresis. There's absolutely no reason to do that. Your client doesn't know what you're talking about. And if you say fever, every single person in the medical community is going to know exactly what
But
you're
man, you sound cool when you say pyuresis.
Yeah, and maybe
like-
at that point, the professional wants to couch the language
Yeah.
to not include the patient.
There is
Like
a
you
little
went
bit
to-
of that, yeah.
Yeah.
You went to school, you got letters next to your name, and you're going to say a pyuresis, a 4-syllable word for fever.
That is just my personal beef. I'm sorry to take away from what you're
No,
talking.
I
just had
understand
to-
it. And professionals spend a lot of time explaining their insider language.
Yeah.
So we in education have that when we're talking with parents. We want to make sure we don't talk over them or use things that are not understandable, because then that doesn't help.
Yeah.
But in terms of communicating within groups, it can be very important. And also one thing that's positive and also interesting is how language changes over time.
Mhm.
That it is absolutely not static. Look at any dictionary.
Yeah.
They add new words. They add, it's a developing system. So I think that's really interesting about language. And also, this is one whole other underqualified podcast about Whorfian theory. Did anybody come across that?
I don't know what that
earlier?
is. Yeah.
So it's the idea that language affects behavior.
Okay.
So language does not exist in a vacuum. If you say a negative thing, if you think a negative thing, you act in a negative way. So there's really a high correlation between language and behavior.
That's very Gandhi, be the change that you want to see in the world kind of context.
It can be positive and negative. Yeah, no, it does. It has a real implications. It's big in psychology. And it takes me to my next topic, which is how language can be negative. And language has words that are pejorative and insulting. And but those words change over time, so it's a little bit of a moving target. But there are some that we know that can really be. And I think one of the ways you can think of what is pejorative and what is negative, if it bases the word that's used in anger generally towards racial differences or physical differences or disability is, of course, the area that I think about. And those words can be used by the in-group, the inside group.
Mm-hmm.
But if they're used in a negative way from the outside group, then they become really just so disabling just on their own. And really are a negative in our culture and are negative towards individuals.
The phenomenon of reclaiming has always fascinated me as a straight white man who doesn't have to reclaim anything because
You've claimed it.
I am the classically, the group that
Right.
looks down on everyone else, unfortunately. But that is the view that I have. I am part of that group that stereotypically is in Western culture. It has sort of looked down on others. The concept of taking a word that the white man uses to put down X group and using it in X group almost as a term of endearment, as a form of identification.
So we have that in disability studies.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So crip.
Yeah.
So crippled, is a terrible word used to evoke pity and not used routinely. But people who talk about disability pride talk about crip culture.
Sure.
And they've reclaimed the word crip and they're happy with it. And I say they because I'm not in that group. I'm not an outsider to that group. But I don't mean to otherize them. with the use of the word they. But I think reclaiming is really interesting, and there's lots of examples of that. Queer
Yeah.
culture.
Yeah, and that was the one that I was going to
Yeah.
think of. And because from my perspective, if there was a word that existed about me that functioned in that regard, which I guess,
There are examples, but
there are
it
examples
doesn't.
of that, but it doesn't
It just
work
doesn't
quite as well.
carry the same weight.
Yeah,
It's not as oppressive. It's
Right.
not as a response to oppression.
right.
Right.
If I was in that situation, obviously I don't know, but I feel like currently that I would just want that word to stop being used.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
that is just personal opinion. I'm not saying
Yeah.
that there's anything wrong, with the way that that's happening, but that is just the way that I personally feel. And so it really interests me that it happens so frequently. In almost every group that is not a majority group, there is a word that they have chosen that they're like,
but
nope, this is ours now.
It wouldn't be monolithic.
Right.
There would be people within the culture group
Oh,
who would say
absolutely,
the same
absolutely,
thing. Would
yeah.
say, I don't want to confront. I don't want to cause this, and I don't want to bring this negative up. But there are those on the more advocacy stream who would say, well, I'm still mad about that. I want that.
Right.
I want that back.
Mhm.
And I can understand that. It just,
Yeah.
I have in no way claim to have any sort of answers about any of that topic. I just, as an outsider, think that it is interesting.
I think it does probably vary within the group, but I think it does on purpose make the outside group uncomfortable. So for example, with the word fat is another, using characteristics as a pejorative.
Mm-hmm.
It's so negative when used as a put down,
as a descriptor of
right,
someone else.
right.
Mhm.
And so that when the group that is talking about body, not dysmorphia, but body pride, positivity.
Yeah.
Positivity. Yeah.
Right. Yes. So claiming fat then has two purposes. I think it decreases their discomfort in hearing it.
Sure.
And it also, I think, puts the user of the word pejoratively a little bit back on his heels. If they like that word, then there's no power in it anymore.
And I would
It
say
does disincentivize the use of that word by a majority group, because since it's used, it functions as an attack. It's like, well, if the minority group is empowered by the use of that word, then it's like, well, we sort of missed on the purpose of it. But
if that worked solidly, it would be wonderful.
It
It doesn't work as well as it could. And the R word, which I don't even like to say in disability studies, it still is so used colloquially in slang, and there's an uninformedness that continues to. It wouldn't matter for that user to know that makes somebody uncomfortable.
Right.
They don't care. Or no, they may not know.
Yeah.
But if they know, they don't care.
I struggle with that word in particular because it's not an English word, which might sound a little bit strange, but let me lean into that a little bit. Because it comes from another language, it is used in other contexts. So we see it in music all the time.
Right.
And not that it's spelled differently, but it means a very specific
I think it's still
thing.
spelled the same.
Isn't it RIT?
Oh, yeah, you're right.
If it's the
right in music.
Is it Latin or Italian, Benjamin?
Italian, I think.
Italian?
Yeah, because it's French. It's a French derivation too.
And so to have a retardando in your music is simply an intentional decrease in your tempo. And in medical conversations, that is an actual diagnosis. It's a side effect of certain medications. And so we talk about how you have to be really careful with medications that you put people on, because some of them can cause what is referred to as mental retardation,
or it can even be more gently, it could retard the growth.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's a more common, not disability related necessarily, use of the R word. Yeah.
As it always makes me wince to read it, but at the same time, it's not wrong.
Yeah.
It is correct.
Yeah. And in its derivation, it just means slow.
Exactly.
So that's, you're slowing down in music. And it was nice how you did that. You brought us back to music.
That wasn't even
Yeah.
intentional. It was just the first thing I thought
Full
of.
circle.
Yeah, no, I think it did. It brought us back to language and music, and language can be different things in different contexts.
Mhm.
Did we go back to context?
There you go.
Context.
Also?
There you go.
But I think context is super important
Mhm.
because back to Worfian theory that language does affect behavior.
Yeah.
So if people use the word negatively even within their context, not at somebody,
Mhm.
even if it's in that's such a blank action that you're doing, stop being such a blank.
Right.
Then that there is an oozing of that into behavior around people who are different, and there's a fear that comes with the language. There's a distance that comes. Oh, I'm not going to be around that person
Mhm.
because they're so different. Obviously, they do things slower, and I don't understand it. So there, it really,
Or just differently, not even necessarily slower. They just don't operate in the same way the way that we
and
want
they don't
them
use
to.
they again. This group doesn't use language the same
Right.
in a lot of cases. So that maybe they don't use language to speak. Maybe they tell you what they need by behavior. Maybe they point. That's still language.
Absolutely.
Even though it doesn't include necessarily verbal like we expect.
Yeah.
So when I do this in my class, my students in disability studies, we go back and forth on this because a lot of them talk about, my students, when I'm saying them, about I'm not careful with my language. I don't care what people think. What that says to me is I'm in the position of power.
Yeah, exactly.
So I don't have to.
You're not worried about it.
I don't have to watch my language.
Right.
Where other people say, "Oh my gosh, I'm really careful about how I speak. I really try to avoid all words that are triggers. I really am. And I change how I speak with different groups, and so people are in a lot of different places along that. Where I try to get the students to is to understand the difference between what we now think of negatively as politically correct language, as cancel culture. We're being so careful that we're not communicating. Well, so that's not good either.
Right.
You don't really want people to stop communicating. That's important.
Yeah.
On the other hand, there's human decency and politeness and concern and courtesy, which I think are important, and where language is an important part of courtesy and politeness.
Yeah.
And I was going to say that I think people sort of want to separate the intent of what was said from its impact. And so a lot of times, I didn't mean it that way, isn't a justification for when it was hurtful to another person. And so, and this is, that can be applied to racial pejoratives, but it's also just something like my colloquial speaking. If I'm addressing a group of people of a variety of genders, I'll still say you guys. Like I say that all the time, and it's something that going into education I need to be working on, because it's not a descriptive term, and that's
I just wouldn't pay attention to you if you said that. I could just kick back. He's not talking to me.
Yeah, it's just and there is from no malicious intent, because how I have grown up colloquially speaking, that just means y'all.
Anyone
in another regional difference.
Yeah.
What does that mean? Like if there's a woman in that group, or if there's a non-binary identifying individual in that group and they're bothered by that, that's still very valid, regardless of whether I was just trying to address the males and being a misogynist or not. So
teachers have a lot of work around language. It's hard,
folks.
Folks, people, everyone.
I was going to say that I teeter on sort of PC culture and cancel culture, which is a whole different discussion, which is a can of worms that we may or may even want to get into, because we try and stay away from actual political discussion in here. Right. But what I was going to say is that I feel like we have gotten so defensive of situations like that sometimes the defense of the offender is kind of hilarious to me. And the example that I will say to both of you, I don't know if either of you heard about this, was that it was either a radio or TV broadcaster for a Major League Baseball team who, as they were going to commercial, said a homophobic slur while live on whichever one they were broadcasting onto. He was shortly thereafter fired by the organization for using a homophobic slur, and there was all of this uproar. I won't say from the baseball community, because most people were like, well, good. But there were people who said, man, 15, 20 years ago, you wouldn't get fired for something like that. I'm like, that is bad. You should be fired for saying homophobic things live on television. Like, I'm sorry. You just, and
just for the sake of
you should get fired for not knowing
specificity.
it's a live mic.
Right? Yeah.
People like that, they have no excuse.
Just for the sake of specificity, we're talking about Tom Brenneman, who used to be the Reds broadcaster.
Thank you.
Or I believe he was with Fox.
Yeah.
So
it happens, and professors have the same scrutiny often around what can be considered informal talk. So be careful.
Yeah,
and don't do that.
That's a situation. If you're a broadcaster or if you're like a spokesperson of any kind for an organization, basically the crux of your job is communication. And so if you have a misstep in which you misrepresent the organization as a whole, then it's just like, well, you shouldn't do that because you're a professional grounded
you're representing a group
in communicating. We had our at my university, we had our spokesperson for the student body diversity council say the N-word in a public event, and it's like, you're going to be fired for that. I believe she handed in her resignation, but it's you should expect to
do better. Don't stop communicating because you're afraid of what people think.
Right,
but do better.
Do better.
And I'll kind of close this out a little bit, talking about my experience in sort of the gaming and live streaming sphere, because I'm a person who is hoping to have a professional career in the not too distant future. And what I mean by like professional is that there's actually, usually that's some form of higher education, there's some form of certification, there's a group. And so I want to be a pharmacist, which is a very respected, and you have to do a lot of work and you have to get a lot of education to do that. And at the same time, you are expected to be a professional individual. So there's this expectation of your ability, but there's also this expectation of your conduct. And so obviously I have started this YouTube channel. Hello, you're watching it. And this Twitch channel within the last 9 months to a year. And I made the conscious decision to, I'm not going to say censor myself, but just in general, try not to give in to the toxicity and profanity that is often common in gaming, because I am recording myself. This is going to be on the internet forever. And so I don't want either a patient or an employer or a coworker to stumble across this channel by accident and see me saying something that is not a good representation of who I am as a person. And so the perfect example of that, and Benjamin, I know you are aware of this because I was talking about it, is Myers Leonard, formerly of the Miami Heat. And basketball player, he was injured he's out for the entirety of this season. He was on a live stream. He's a member of, I believe he was a member of FaZe Clan, which is just a gaming organization. And he was live with several Call of Duty streamers, and he dropped an anti-Semitic slur during the stream. It was very obvious. It was a moment that he got killed by another player. He was clearly upset. He took several seconds. You could see it in the video of him trying to figure out what nasty word he was going to use to describe this other person. And then he tossed that out there. He was traded to, I believe, the Oklahoma City Thunder, who then paid out his contract and released him. So basically it was just a trade to get rid of him. He was fined substantially by the league. He lost, the Twitch channel that he was streaming on. He lost basically all of his endorsements. He lost his role in FaZe Clan. And I made a post on Facebook about it, and I was like, if you cannot keep slurs out of your vocabulary, don't stream. Don't just, especially if you
There's
were
got
a
to be an
person,
understanding that you're live to a significant audience,
yes,
and so there's no reclaiming anything that you've said once it's out there. There's a difference between that and, YouTubers who have put up controversial content and then had to apologize for it. It's like there's less room for making amends because you had to edit the video for
right,
hours and then decide to post it
and
and
put it
then
up,
leave it
yeah.
up for an amount of time. And not saying that, Myers Leonard should automatically be put back into good graces because he was live. That's not what I'm getting at all. But it's just like it's a more that like immediately there are immediate consequences when you're live streaming because it's just right out there into
Happens
the world
instantly,
for
yeah.
everyone to see once you've said it. So
Well, this was really fun.
yeah.
Yeah, at bare minimum, if you can't keep it, just don't stream. At least do not present your racial slurs to the thousands of people that are watching you. That's how I'm going to leave this. We don't have thousands of people watching us, but I think that is something that is worth saying because apparently people don't know that.
We're not endorsing the use of slurs.
All slurs. All slurs.
All are bad.
All slurs.
But thank you everybody so much for watching. I want to thank Aunt Carolyn for coming on the podcast. And well, it's not a podcast, it's a video show, and talking with us. I hope that you guys have enjoyed this. It was kind of a different episode in a way that I liked. If you have suggestions on other things that we should talk about, please put them in the comments below. We always love to hear from you guys about what we should be working on, and we hope that you're all doing well. Thanks so much.
Thanks, guys. See you next time.